A police officer burned a black boy's hand with a lighter in a horrifying act of cruelty. What happened next when the boy's father got involved will leave you speechless. The 10-year-old black boy entered the general store, a small neighborhood shop with rows of brightly lit shelves stocked with snacks, drinks, and household items. He had come for a simple reason: to buy some treats for himself. Dressed in a plain t-shirt and jeans, the boy walked through the aisles, his small hands carefully picking out his favorite snacks one by one. His expression was calm, his mind focused entirely on what he wanted to buy. As he selected each item, he tucked them into the pockets of his jeans. His intention was innocent. He wanted to keep his hands free while he browsed and would pay for everything at the register before leaving. His actions were routine and unremarkable, but he was completely unaware that his every move was being watched. Near the entrance of the store stood a police officer. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, wore a crisp uniform that bore the signs of his rank and authority. His expression was hard and judgmental as he scanned the store. His gaze landed on the boy the moment he entered, and he immediately became suspicious. The officer's thoughts were clouded by bias. He saw a young black boy, alone and unsupervised, and assumed trouble would follow. His mind jumped to conclusions as he silently observed the boy, convinced that someone of his age and background had no legitimate reason to be there. When the officer saw the boy placing snacks into his pockets, his suspicions hardened into certainty. He believed he was witnessing a case of shoplifting instead of intervening. Immediately, he decided to watch from a distance, moving through the store's aisles with slow, deliberate steps. The boy, oblivious to the officer's presence, continued to browse. He paused in front of the candy section, tilting his head as he debated between two options. Finally making his decision, he slipped a bag of candy into his pocket. The officer, watching from behind a display, narrowed his eyes. His hand rested on his belt as he stepped closer, his boots clicking softly against the tiled floor. By the time the boy turned around, the officer was standing directly behind him, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the smaller child. The boy's eyes widened in shock as he looked up, startled by the man's sudden appearance. The officer's face was etched with anger and disdain. His jaw clenched as he stared down at the boy. Without waiting for an explanation, the officer launched into an accusation. He told the boy that he was a thief, his tone cold and sharp. The boy froze, confused and frightened by the officer's harsh words. Before he could respond, the officer continued, claiming that black people like him were responsible for ruining the neighborhood. He suggested that the boy's father was likely a criminal as well. His voice dripping with contempt. The boy's heart raced in his chest. His hands trembled as he tried to find the words to defend himself. He stammered, saying that he wasn't stealing and had planned to pay for the snacks once he was done choosing everything he needed. His voice was small and shaky, barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The officer dismissed his explanation with a sneer, his lips curling into a mocking smile. He told the boy that thieves always made excuses and insisted that he didn't believe a word he was saying. The officer's gaze was unwavering, his eyes boring into the boy's with an intensity that made the child feel smaller and more powerless than ever. Reaching out, the officer grabbed the boy by the arm. His grip was firm, almost bruising. As he pulled the child closer, he told the boy that he needed to learn a lesson about stealing and commanded him to follow him. Outside, the boy, terrified and unsure of what else to do, obeyed. His legs felt weak as he followed the officer toward the door, his mind racing with fear and confusion. He wanted to cry out for help, to explain himself again, but the officer's intimidating presence silenced him. The other shoppers in the store watched the scene unfold in silence. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others turned away, entirely unwilling to get involved. The boy felt the weight of their gazes as he was led out of the store, his head hanging low and his pockets still full of the snacks he had intended to buy. As the door closed Behind them, the officer's grip tightened. On the boy's arm, the harshness of the man's words and actions had left the boy. Too frightened to resist, he didn't know what was going to happen next, but he could feel the air around him grow heavier with tension. The boy tried once more to explain himself, his voice trembling as he repeated that he wasn't stealing and had planned to pay for everything. The officer, unimpressed, ignored his words and instead began to lecture him about the consequences of theft. His tone was condescending, as though he was speaking to someone much younger or incapable of understanding. The boy's eyes filled with tears as he stood there, trapped and unable to escape. His small frame seemed to shrink under the officer's gaze, and he felt as though the world around him had closed in completely. The boy stepped outside the store, his heart pounding in his chest as the police officer followed close behind him. The air outside was heavy, and the setting sun cast long shadows across the pavement. The boy's small frame trembled as he turned to face the officer, his wide eyes glistening with unused tears. He clutched the edge of his pocket where the snacks rested, hoping to reason with the officer, but the man's cold and unyielding expression told him there was no room for explanation. The officer looked around, scanning the area to make sure there were no witnesses. The street was quiet, with only a faint hum of distant traffic in the background. Satisfied that no one was watching, he turned his attention back to the boy. His eyes narrowed and his lips curled into a smirk as he lowed over the child. The boy shifted nervously, his body tensing as the officer stepped closer. The man's voice, cold and deliberate, cut through the silence. He told the boy that he was going to make sure he never stole again, claiming that it was his duty to teach him a lesson. The boy's fear intensified. He stammered out a plea, insisting once again that he hadn't stolen anything and had intended to pay for the snacks. His words came out in a rush, his voice shaking as he tried to make the officer understand, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small metal object. The boy's breath caught in his throat as the officer held up a lighter. The polished silver casing reflected the fading sunlight, and the small object seemed to glow ominously in the officer's hand. The man tilted his head slightly, holding the lighter up for the boy to see. The officer asked if the boy knew what the object was. His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of menace. The boy's lips quivered as he answered in a barely audible whisper that it was a lighter. His eyes flickered with confusion and fear as he tried to understand why the officer had brought it out. The man smirked, flipping the lid of the lighter open with a sharp metallic click. The sound made the boy flinch. The officer ignited the flame, the small tongue of fire flickering in the dimming light. He held it up between them, the warm glow casting eerie shadows on his face. The officer's tone turned condescending as he explained the purpose of the lighter. He told the boy that it burned and described how in ancient times thieves were punished by being thrown into fire. The boy's heart sank as he realized the officer's intentions, and his body began to shake uncontrollably. The boy's eyes widened in terror as he took a step back, instinctively trying to put distance between himself and the flame. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, his small voice pleading with the officer to let him go. Tears spilled from his eyes as he begged for mercy, promising that he would never steal and that he hadn't meant any harm. But the officer was unmoved by the boy's pleas. He dismissed the child's cries as excuses. His face hard and unforgiving, he stepped forward, closing the gap between them, and repeated that the boy needed to learn a lesson. Before the boy could react, the officer reached out and grabbed his arm. Holding it firmly in his rough grip, the boy struggled weakly, but he was too small and frightened to break free. The officer brought the lighter closer, the flame dancing perilously close to the boy's skin. The boy's sobs grew louder, and he twisted his body in an attempt to escape, but the officer's grip tightened. Without hesitation, the man pressed the flame against the boy's arm. For a brief moment. The searing heat pierced the boy's skin, sending a shock of pain through his body. He let out a blood-curdling scream as the flame burned into him, leaving a red, blistering mark. The pain was overwhelming, and the boy's vision blurred with tears as he clutched his arm, trying to soothe the burning sensation. The officer released him, watching coldly as the boy collapsed to his knees. The child sobbed uncontrollably, his small frame shaking as he cradled his injured arm. His cries echoed through the empty street, a heartbreaking sound that seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officer stood over him, the lighter still in his hand. He extinguished the flame with a flick of his thumb and slipped the object back into his pocket. His tone was casual as he warned the boy not to steal again, adding that if it happened a second time, he wouldn't be as lenient. The boy, too overwhelmed by pain and fear to respond, stumbled to his feet. His legs felt weak beneath him, but he forced himself to move, clutching his injured arm as he turned and ran. The snacks in his pocket forgotten in the chaos rustled with every step. Tears streamed down his face as he fled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced with a mixture of emotions: fear, confusion, and a deep sense of injustice. He couldn't understand why the officer had treated him so cruelly, or why no one had been there to help him. The journey home felt endless, every step a struggle against the weight of his pain and the humiliation he had endured. His arm throbbed with every movement, the burn mark a constant reminder of the officer's punishment. By the time he reached his house, the boy's face was red and swollen from crying, his vision blurred with fresh tears as he approached the door, his only thought being to find his father. The boy's small hand reached for the doorknob, trembling as he pushed it open and stepped inside, desperate for the comfort and safety of his home. The boy burst through the front door of his home, his small frame shaking with sobs, and his tear-streaked face twisted in pain and fear. His right arm was clutched tightly to his chest, and his steps were unsteady as he stumbled into the living room. His father, a respected judge known for his calm demeanor and unwavering pursuit of justice, was seated in his favorite chair, engrossed in a stack of legal documents. The sound of the door slamming open immediately drew his attention, and he looked up in alarm. The judge stood quickly, his tall frame radiating concern as he took in the sight of his son. The boy's disheveled appearance and tear-filled eyes made his heart clench, and he hurried across the room to kneel in front of the child. He gently grasped his son's shoulders, lowering his voice to a soothing tone as he asked what had happened. The boy collapsed into his father's arms, his small body shaking with sobs as he clung to the man's shirt. It took him a few moments to gather himself enough to speak, and even then his words came out in broken fragments between gasping breaths. Slowly he recounted the events that had unfolded at the store. The police officer who had accused him of stealing dragged him outside and burned his skin with a lighter. As the boy spoke, the judge listened intently, his initial confusion giving way to a deep and simmering anger. His hands tightened slightly on the boy's shoulders as he took in the details of the story, his sharp mind piecing together the injustice his son had endured. When the boy hesitated, struggling to describe the pain he had felt, the judge gently encouraged him to continue, his voice calm but filled with quiet determination. The boy eventually pulled back slightly and unwrapped his arm, revealing the angry red welt left by the officer's lighter. The mark stood out starkly against his dark skin, and the judge felt a wave of anguish wash over him at the sight. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them away, unwilling to let his son see the depth of his pain. The judge pulled the boy into another embrace, holding him tightly as he whispered reassurances. He told his son that everything would be okay, that no one had the right to hurt him, and that he would make sure the officer paid for what he had done. His words carried the weight of his resolve, and though his son's sobs didn't stop immediately, the boy clung to his father as if those words were a lifeline. That evening the judge sat his Son down in the kitchen pulling out a first aid kit to treat the burn. His hands were steady as he carefully cleaned the wound, though his jaw tightened with every wince and whimper that escaped the boy's lips. He applied a cooling ointment to the mark and covered it with a bandage. His move gentle but deliberate. The two of them sat in silence for a few moments. After he finished, the boy's breathing finally evening out as the initial shock began to fade. The judge placed a hand on his son's shoulder, looking him in the eye and assuring him once again that he would handle the situation. He explained that they would go to the police station the next morning and make sure the officer was held accountable. His voice was calm and steady, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside him. The next morning, the judge rose early, dressed in his formal attire, and prepared himself for the confrontation. Ahead, he helped his son get ready, making sure the boy was comfortable and reassured before they left the house. As they walked to the car, the boy stayed close to his father's side, his small hand gripping the man's coat tightly. The drive to the police station was quiet, the air inside the car heavy with unspoken tension. The boy stared out the window, his injured arm resting on his lap, while the judge kept his focus on the road, his expression unreadable. When they arrived, the boy hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car, his father's steady presence giving him the courage to move forward. Inside, the station officers and staff immediately recognized the judge. Conversations hushed and heads turned as he walked through the room, his commanding presence drawing everyone's attention. The staff's expressions ranged from respect to curiosity as they wondered what had brought someone of his stature to the station. In person, the judge approached the front desk, his son standing close by, and requested to see the officer who had been on duty at the store the previous day. His tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for argument. The staff complied quickly, their movement sufficient, as they located the officer in question and escorted him to the room. When the officer entered, the boy's grip on his father's coat tightened and his small voice trembled as he identified the man. The officer's confident stride faltered when he saw the judge, his expression shifting from indifference to apprehension. The judge's piercing gaze locked onto the officers, and the room seemed to grow colder. The judge stepped forward, his voice calm but laced with unmistakable authority. As he addressed the man, he stated plainly that his son had accused the officer of burning him and demanded an explanation. The officer hesitated, his earlier bravado fading under the weight of the judge's presence. He stammered out a response, trying to downplay the incident, but the judge's steady gaze and sharp questions left no room for evasion. The boy standing beside his father looked up at the officer with a mixture of fear and defiance, his earlier tears replaced by a quiet resolve. The confrontation was just beginning, but the officer already knew that his actions would not go unpunished. The judge's unwavering determination made it clear that justice would be served, no matter the cost. The judge locked eyes with the officer, his steely gaze piercing through the man's growing facade of panic. The officer, realizing the gravity of his actions, began to stammer an explanation. His earlier air of authority had evaporated, replaced by a visible nervousness as he attempted to justify what he had done. Words tumbled out in fragments, each weaker than the last, but the judge remained unmoved. The judge raised a hand to silence the man, his tone calm yet unyielding. He spoke with measured authority, recounting the accusations his son had brought against the officer. He declared that burning a child, regardless of the circumstance, was an inhumane act and utterly unacceptable. The accusation hung heavily in the air, and every pair of eyes in the room turned to the officer, awaiting his response. The officer's face turned pale, and sweat bead on his forehead. He realized there was no way to deflect the weight of the evidence stacked against him. His legs buckled as he dropped to his knees, abandoning all attempts at explanation. His voice cracked as he began pleading for forgiveness, his earlier confidence reduced to desperate appeals, he begged the judge to reconsider, claiming the incident had been a misunderstanding, that he hadn't meant to harm the boy. The judge remained unmoved, his expression as resolute as stone. He demanded the officer's badge, number, and name, ensuring that the man's identity would be on record. He reiterated his determination to seek justice for his son, stating that no amount of begging or excuses would absolve the officer of what he had done. With cold precision, the judge filed an official complaint at the station. He recounted the events exactly as his son had described them, detailing the officer's cruel actions and the physical evidence of the burn. The staff, accustomed to the judge's presence as a respected figure of the law, worked quickly to process the complaint. Sensing the gravity of the situation, the case moved swiftly through the legal system, garnering significant attention due to the judge's prominence and the shocking nature of the allegations. In court, the officer sat hunched at the defendant's table, his once proud demeanor now replaced by visible shame. He avoided eye contact with anyone, especially the judge and his son, whose presence filled the courtroom with silent intensity. The boy testified, bravely recounting the events with a mixture of clarity and emotion. Though his voice wavered at times, the truth of his words was undeniable. He described the officer's accusations the moment he was dragged outside, and the unbearable pain of the flame against his skin. The burn mark on his arm was presented as evidence, a glaring reminder of the cruelty inflicted upon him. Witnesses from the store were called to testify, corroborating the boy's account of the officer's behavior inside the shop. Each testimony further solidified the case, painting a damning picture of the officer's actions and his abuse of power. Throughout the proceedings, the judge maintained a stoic composure despite his personal connection to the case. He allowed the legal process to unfold impartially, ensuring that the evidence spoke for itself. He had faith in the system he had dedicated his life to, and knew that justice would prevail. When the verdict was finally delivered, the court found the officer guilty of assaulting a minor. The sentence was severe yet fitting: 2 years in prison and a permanent suspension from his position on the police force. The judge's reputation had not influenced the outcome, only the irrefutable evidence and the officer's own action had led to his conviction. As the officer was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his face a mask of regret and humiliation, the boy felt a sense of relief wash over him. The justice served in that courtroom brought a closure he hadn't thought possible in the days following the incident. While the physical pain of the burn would heal with time, the emotional scars were soothed by the knowledge that his father had fought tirelessly to protect him and ensure accountability. For the judge, the experience was bittersweet. The sight of his son's tear-streaked face and injured arm had been a painful reminder of the prejudice and cruelty that still existed in the world. Yet it had also reaffirmed his commitment to justice and his belief in the power of the law to hold even those in positions of authority accountable for their actions. As the judge and his son left the courtroom together, reporters gathered outside, their cameras flashing as they sought to capture the moment. The judge ignored them, placing a